July 1944, Normandy, northwest France. American forces take a beachhead after the successful landings of Operation Overlord. However, further advances stalled. The German defenses clung to every inch of ground, exploiting the unique bocage hedgerows of the region, capable of concealing infantry and tanks. Days of endless fighting that halted the advance gave way to the expectation of a decisive breakthrough. General Omar Bradley, commander of American forces in the sector, is preparing a major operation. The objective is to break through the front south of St. Lo. To accomplish this, forces from two corps, the 7th and 8th, are being assembled, with over 2,000 armored vehicles and artillery and ammunition being prepared. The units are awaiting the signal to attack, but they know the attack will be accompanied by inhuman air power. At dawn on July 24, 1944, American infantrymen dig trenches on the front lines. The roar of engines roars overhead. Some 3,000 aircraft are involved in the operation, including B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator heavy strategic bombers, and hundreds of fighter bombers. These aircraft carry thousands of tons of bombs designed to rip apart German positions, clear the way for ground troops, and offer a long-awaited chance to break out of static trench warfare. However, conditions on this day are far from ideal. Fog obscures the valleys and lowlands, rain fell during the night, and visibility is reduced to a few hundred meters. Plans and theoretical calculations converge on one thing. With so many aircraft and bombs, precise targeting is essential. The slightest deviation could lead to errors. Nevertheless, the troops continue their march. The pause has lasted too long, and morale demands action. A few minutes after the first aircraft appeared, the atmosphere above the trenches exploded. Bombs dropped at predicted coordinates unexpectedly landed not on the expected German positions, but several hundred meters to the north, right on the American trenches. In a matter of moments, the explosions engulfed the 30th and 9th Infantry Division's own units, demolishing medical facilities, destroying equipment, and devastating hospitals and command posts. It immediately becomes clear. The bombers, equipped with night vision sights, had failed to visually navigate. The effect of bad weather, the same miscalculation, a coincidence of wind and erroneous coordinates. The first catastrophe leaves no time for reflection. Radio traffic fills with alarms. Bombs landing on friendly fire, abort the attack, fire on our positions. At this point, the sky becomes a death zone for American infantrymen. They take cover, try to escape the blast waves, search for the wounded, call for help, and pull comrades from the rubble. The losses become immediately apparent. Over 100 American soldiers killed in the first minutes of the operation, according to anonymous reports from headquarters. A great miscalculation begins in this great operation. The tragic airstrike wasn't a blip, but the beginning of what is now known as Operation Cobra's friendly fire. When thousands of aircraft thunder over the world, any mistake becomes a mass catastrophe. And the first strike that day was not against the enemy, but against our own. Operation Cobra marked the culmination of the Allies' arduous efforts to expand beyond the Normandy beachhead gained in the June 6, 1944 landings. After the first few days of intense fighting, the front stabilized. German troops had established a solid defense along the perimeter of the captured territory, exploiting the local landscape. Advancement was particularly hampered by the bocages, dense hedgerows created by French farmers over centuries. These mounds and thickets provided ideal natural fortifications, impenetrable to armored vehicles, and convenient for German saboteurs and snipers. American forces faced difficulties unforeseen even in the most pessimistic scenarios. Slow progress, heavy losses of infantry and tanks, and a lack of maneuverability. Furthermore, constant German counterattacks, well-supplied defenses, and clever use of the terrain kept the front virtually motionless. Units that captured coastal towns suffered from constant shelling, night raids, and the inability to exploit their superior equipment. By early July, the Allied command, primarily American generals Omar Bradley and George Patton, realized that a breakthrough required a massive air and artillery strike against the most vulnerable section of the front. At meetings, they developed a detailed plan to disrupt the German defenses through carpet bombing and artillery preparation. The plan was given the code name Operation Cobra, symbolizing a swift and decisive breakthrough that would extricate the troops from protracted trench warfare. For Operation Cobra, the Americans are amassing over 37 divisions and 2,500 tanks at the front and preparing artillery. Over 1,000 guns will rain over 140,000 shells on the enemy. 3,000 aircraft, B-17s, B-24s, P-47s, P-51s, and Marauders, strategic bombers and fighters, are to be deployed in the skies. The goal of the airstrike is to completely destroy the German defensive lines south and southwest of St. Lo and clear the way for a lightning strike by armored vehicles and infantry. The idea seems promising. A large Allied force, numerical and technical superiority, and experience in Army-Air Force cooperation after Africa and Italy. The commanders are confident that under a barrage of air and artillery strikes, the defensive line will collapse, the Germans will be unable to regroup, and the Americans will make a rapid advance, capturing new territory and expanding their bridgehead. However, it was the details of the operation, calculations, weather conditions, guidance systems, communications between aircraft and ground forces, that would later lead to fatal errors. By mid-July 1944, the American command had amassed a force at the St. Lo lines that was the largest in the theater of war. General Omar Bradley played a key role in planning Operation Cobra, whose First Army was directly tasked with breaking through the front south of St. Lo. The 7th and 8th Corps, more than 110,000 men, over 2,500 tanks, and tens of thousands of vehicles and self-propelled guns were concentrated here. The offensive was to be supported by a massive air offensive. Under fighter cover, the support group included nearly 1,500 medium and heavy bombers, B-17s, B-24s, and P-47 Thunderbolts. Their mission was to use a powerful airstrike to literally wipe out the German front line, trenches, bunkers, communication lines, artillery positions, ammunition depots, and reserves, preventing supplies and regrouping. Preparations proceeded in stages. American command, in conjunction with bomber aircraft, planned a series of carpet strikes along the offensive front. To maximize effectiveness, a bombing method with cross-front routes was chosen, allowing for maximum coverage of the enemy's chosen defensive zone. Everything was decided literally by the minute. Tanks and infantry were to rush forward immediately following the wave of explosions. However, the carefully crafted plan on paper envisioned a high degree of mutual trust and communication between ground forces and air forces. Coordination was extremely complex. The bombing was carried out literally hundreds of meters from the first Allied trench lines. The danger of friendly fire was recognized, but it was hoped that the precision of the targeting would outweigh the risk. Engineering units were also involved in the work. They plotted routes and installed flags and markers for the pilots to use as navigation aids. Radio communications, missile signals, and visual references, everything was subordinated to a single goal: minimizing the risk of error. Despite this complex of measures, the approach itself, delivering massive carpet strikes directly in front of advancing troops, had not yet been honed in practice and carried the risk of unintended losses. Weather conditions and morale also played a significant role. It rained for a week before the operation, the fields became muddy, and visibility was below average. Bombing missions were postponed and monitored by weather reports. The infantry awaited orders, the trenches were overcrowded, and the atmosphere was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The very structure of the strike was the Allies' first experience of its kind in Western Europe. America had never before employed such a number of bombers, and the density of the barrage in either Africa or Italy. This innovative calculation also entailed a high degree of risk. The Army was prepared to go all in, believing that the effect of surprise and scale would justify any potential mistakes. Bradley and his staff insisted on precise coordination. After the final bomber wave, ground troops were to assault the German fortifications in a matter of minutes, while the enemy was disorganized and unable to retake their positions. It was believed that this solution would give the Allies an advantage and turn the tide of the Normandy campaign. Everyone was waiting for the signal. It seemed everything had been taken into account. But what happened on the morning of July 24th demonstrated the limits of even the most modern military logistics. It's the morning of July 24th, 1944. Troops of the 1st American Army are at their starting lines, awaiting air support. The weather is not on their side. Low clouds, fog, and rain are hampering navigation, with visibility often limited to 300-400 meters. Command, however, decides not to delay the attack. The troops have been stuck in trench warfare for too long, and every day of delay promises losses and a loss of morale. At 9 a.m., a massive preparation begins. Over 140,000 artillery shells are fired at German positions. Divisional and corps artillery fires ceaselessly, attempting to neutralize any fortifications that could delay the infantry and tanks at the start of the offensive. Troops take cover in trenches, hugging the ground, trusting in the barrage to provide them with support. At 10:30, the first groups of heavy bombers appeared along the front. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators entered formation, dropping tons of bombs designed to completely destroy the first lines of German defense. Carpet bombing was carried out over a strip approximately 6.5 kilometers, 6,400 meters wide. Ground calculations, visual reference points, and flags laid by American engineering units were intended to prevent errors. However, in practice, the plan unfolded according to a more complex scenario. Due to low clouds, choppy winds, and navigational problems, some crews were not fully prepared for operations at such altitudes and in such weather conditions. Some aircraft dropped their bombs north of the intended kill zone, directly on the positions of the American 30th and 9th Infantry Divisions. The result is instant tragedy. Within minutes, dozens and hundreds of bombs fall on friendly trenches, medical battalions, and command posts. The wounded are unable to evacuate, equipment burns, supply and communication routes are cut off, and hospitals are hit right next to the front lines. The first radio reports are filled with messages like friendly fire, losses of our own units, change course of fire, but the massive bombing continues as instructed by air groups. The chaos worsened. Some crews received corrected coordinates as they approached their target, others relied on previous data, and still others relied on visual cues. But due to the weather, the latter were virtually non-existent. Officers on the ground shouted, trying to warn their crews, but it was too late to take action. The losses were catastrophic. Over 150 soldiers were killed and several hundred wounded on the morning of July 24th alone. Instead of support and surprise, the Americans experienced disorganization, fear, and demoralization. At this point, Bradley and his staff were forced to urgently suspend the operation. Further advancement became impossible with such risks. Nevertheless, some American units continue to hold their positions, under fire, without support, in conditions where the direction of the attack has become uncertain. Operational documents describe these losses as unintentional, but at the front, this tragedy is referred to as an aviation fiasco. Troops and commanders understand that the error was not caused by malicious intent, but by a combination of human factors, weather conditions, and a mission unfamiliar to the Air Force. Such close coordination of the air and infantry attack only further demonstrated the limits of technology and organization in 1944. The command's decision was to halt the Cobra attack and urgently recalculate the coordinates, recoordinate the attack phases, wait for improved weather, and provide new identification systems for the pilots. The fate of the largest operation in the history of the American military now depended on whether the leadership could learn from this tragic experience or repeat the mistake again. Following the air disaster of July 24th, High Headquarters quickly convened an emergency meeting. The American command, recognizing the gravity of their own blow to their own forces, decided to suspend the operation. Generals Bradley, Collins, and Patton demanded a thorough recheck of coordinates, the creation of new road signs for pilots, a check of weather conditions, and the standardization of all calculations. However, the strategic situation did not allow for waiting. The Germans were already noticing the preparations, and given time, they could pull up reserves, fortify bottlenecks on the front, and prolong the initial situation for weeks or months. Therefore, the operation had to be resumed the following day, July 25th. The night between the two strikes is filled with scenes of evacuating the wounded, deploying reinforcements, and engineering work to mark new markers along the front line. The work proceeds at the pace of military time pressure. To prevent a repeat of the tragedy, ground units are manufacturing new markers. Air forces are ordered to act with redoubled caution when transmitting coordinates. Air defense forces are instructed to identify equipment and positions on the ground as clearly as possible, and communicators at all levels are working non-stop. July 25th, morning. The weather is slightly better but still unstable. Fog lingers in patches over the fields. The clouds are not low, but gusty winds could alter the bomb's trajectory. With dawn, the main attack arrives. A gigantic wave, 2,500 heavy and medium bombers, reinforced by low-level attacks from fighter bombers. The American headquarters is working in a coordinated manner. They consistently call in airstrikes on squares, minimizing the time between waves to allow for the rapid advance of infantry and tanks. However, once again, the work is hampered by errors. Due to gusty winds, navigational delays, and difficulties synchronizing aircraft movement corridors, some of them again drop bombs on the northwestern sectors of their front line, and again on friendly forces, this time directly on the positions of the 30th Infantry Division. The results proved fatal. The final tally for July 25th revealed no fewer than 662 killed and 1,500 wounded. Combined with the casualties of the previous day, the friendly fire became the most tragic air blunder for the Allies in the entire campaign. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the U.S. Army's most experienced commanders, who had arrived to inspect forward units. His death marked America's worst combat defeat at the command level during the entire war. On the front lines, the same scenario as yesterday is repeating itself. Trenches are destroyed, equipment is disabled, and hospitals are caught in devastating explosions. The wounded are receiving treatment under fire, medics and officers are extracting the injured from the rubble, and survivors are immediately evacuated to rear areas. After this air raid, the front line was almost completely cleared, but the moral effect among the Americans was twofold. We were burying our comrades, passing through broken fortifications, but we knew that today, not only the dirty Germans died, but also our friends. In these days, commanders at all levels realize that no technology, no planning can predict the human factor, weather conditions, and the level of training of crews when it comes to such a density of attack right in front of their army. Despite the tragedy, the operation is not canceled. The combat mission remains in effect. The Americans continue to press, and reports begin to record that the failure and catastrophic error failed to thwart the strategic plan, but at the cost of thousands of lives. The bombing of July 24th and 25, 1944, became the worst friendly fire disaster for American forces in Western Europe. The final report after 2 days of airstrikes on friendly positions shocked even seasoned war correspondents. Total American losses for those 2 days alone exceeded 1,000 killed, with more than 1,500 wounded. Various sources cite figures ranging from 1,116 to 1,176 American fatalities, over 1,000 wounded for one day, and approximately 2,000 for the entire operation. Particularly tragic was the death of a general officer, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of the U.S. Army, who had personally arrived to inspect the positions of the 30th Infantry Division on the eve of the offensive. McNair, serving in frontline reserves, was killed by a direct hit from a B-17 bomb. This profoundly shocked not only the unit, which lost many officers and soldiers, but also the Army command. It was one of the rare cases of an American general dying in combat, not at the hands of the enemy, but as a result of a mistaken friendly strike. Forward medical stations were literally blanketed by bombs, killing numerous personnel, orderlies, doctors, and the wounded evacuated from the fire. Ambulances, technicians, and evacuation trucks were unable to immediately reach the blast zone. Part of the routes were destroyed by carpet bombing, and the infrastructure was so damaged that many wounded died before receiving support. The blast wave and massive fires after the raid reduced the forward area and trenches to rubble, and most of the equipment in the attack sectors was damaged or destroyed. Many vehicles burned in the open, and tanks were hit not by the enemy, but by their own aircraft. Surviving soldiers and officers wrote letters home, describing the shock and horror of what had happened. Reports that the main losses were in fact caused not by enemy fire, but by Allied air power, were subsequently carefully censored. Stalwart infantrymen lost faith in the infallibility of their command, and many developed a fear of the big Air Force even after the Cobra effect, the subsequent success of the offensive, was born. Among the trench beams, the wreckage of equipment, and the corpses of soldiers buried in fresh craters, one could hear not only groans and cries for help, but also angry discussions. Why are our own people bombing us? Who is to blame? What was going on at Air Force headquarters? The demoralization of entire battalions on the front lines was recorded. In the following days, staff analysts collected dozens of witness statements, studied the pilot's official reports, and determined that the repeated error was the result of several factors: poor sighting and imperfect guidance equipment, low clouds, interference in visual search of targets, illegibility of markers on the ground, partial disregard for the latest plan adjustments by various air groups, stress and haste of organizing a massive strike. Immediately after the attack, medical battalions were not evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, but providing emergency surgical care to their own, which led to delays in other areas, a fact noted as a cascading crisis. The evacuation system and support for entire chains of internal services were disrupted by two waves of errors. After the raid, former sector commanders, and particularly the divisions that bore the brunt, referred to the days of Operation Cobra as a double defeat. The lightning-fast advance had been possible, but at the cost of psychological and physical trauma for many of their soldiers. The losses of senior officers, including General McNair, were perceived as a personal tragedy by the U.S. command staff. Official reports immediately described the aircraft losses as unintentional, which later became the standard euphemism for all mass friendly fire errors of the 20th century. Frontline chronicles, diaries, and post-war memoirs reveal how deeply this tragedy lingered in the American Army, and how deeply it impacted the generation of commanders who bore the brunt of the first mistake of large-scale heavy air support for infantry. After the first two unsuccessful days, Operation Cobra attracted the attention of the American High Command. The generals praised the effectiveness of the fire strikes, which had essentially broken through the German defenses, but were deeply alarmed by the heavy losses of their own troops as a result of air errors. General George Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, which was supposed to deliver the main blow after the breakthrough, reacted harshly. He was deeply disappointed and outraged that his troops suffered precisely from Allied bombing. In his personal diaries, Patton expressed dissatisfaction and condemnation of the events. "This is not just a mistake, it's a crime. We lost friends where we should have won battles." The U.S. Army Command aimed to quickly and effectively seize key positions, preventing internal conflicts or mistakes from hindering the breakthrough. Patton, known for his toughness and exactingness, insisted on identifying the causes of tactical and organizational failures and taking the strictest measures to prevent recurrences. Nevertheless, despite the outrage and demands for an investigation, the U.S. Air Force Command and Army headquarters decided to limit publicity about the incident so as not to undermine troop morale and public opinion. Official summaries and reports described the incident as circumstances of war, collateral combat losses, and inadvertent airstrikes on the battlefield. Orders contained a direct instruction to keep silent and continue with assigned missions. Indirectly, the essence of silence was the mechanism for managing information, which was considered the norm in the context of intense military conflict. Information about the incident was practically non-existent in the press, and the families of the victims were often informed of their deaths at the front without clarification of the true cause. Numerous participants in the operation, especially bomber pilots who witnessed the horrific aftermath, remained silent for many decades. The topic was considered taboo, associated with severe psychological trauma and a loss of trust in their own army. In his diary, uncovered years later, Patton noted that his army had suffered one of the greatest and perhaps most foolish losses caused by its own mistakes. Despite this, he emphasized the need to actively use air power in conjunction with the ground offensive, maintaining confidence in the overall plan's success. Allied command quickly analyzed the situation, identified lessons, and drew conclusions. But specific punishments and trials were not carried out. The advantages of the breakthrough and the overall strategic goal turned out to be more important from the command's point of view than the disclosure and detailed investigation of the tragedy. The situation has become a subject of study in post-war military schools and think tanks, where the Operation Cobra blunder is seen as one of the most unfortunate examples of friendly fire, with grave consequences for the morale and organizational experience of the troops. Overall, the reaction to the incident in military circles was fraught with contradictions. On the one hand, high discipline and strict accounting of errors were required, while on the other, caution and control over information were required to maintain overall morale. It was precisely this duality that determined the almost silent coverage of the tragedy in the history of the operation. Moving on to the next stage, it can be said that, despite the lessons learned, the tragedy of Operation Cobra became a harsh reminder of the complexity of modern air-ground conflict and the high price that armies pay for coordination failures in conditions of intense and complex combat. Despite heavy losses due to air errors and the tragic consequences of the first days of Operation Cobra, American troops were able to capitalize on the advantages gained through massive airstrikes and artillery preparation. By the evening of July 25th, the front began to collapse, and a successful offensive against the German defensive line located south of St. Lo began. Military formations of the 7th Corps of the 1st U.S. Army, supported by artillery and air power, broke through enemy defenses in key areas. Around July 28th, American troops were actively advancing deeper into the territory, capturing positions previously held by German forces for so long. This began a major breakthrough that would ultimately lead to the creation of the infamous Falaise Pocket, a strategic encirclement of German forces. The Germans attempted a counterattack west of St. Lo, Operation Lüttich, to restore their positions and cut Allied supply lines, but they suffered defeat and found themselves in a difficult position. The Wehrmacht's tank divisions lost up to half their strength, and the enemy began a steady retreat, losing key positions. By August 1944, Operation Cobra had fully launched, allowing American forces to liberate significant areas of northwestern France, including the cities of Avranches and St. Lo. By August 25th, the Allies had captured Paris and completed the expansion of the beachhead established in early June on the Normandy coast. Cobra's victory was a strategically crucial turning point in the course of World War II on the Western Front. However, the cost was horribly high, not only due to German losses, but more importantly, due to the serious failures to coordinate the preparatory airstrikes, which resulted in the deaths or injuries of over 1,000 American soldiers from friendly fire. These tragic episodes are virtually unrecorded in official reports, which describe the losses as unintentional and conceal the true scale. Nevertheless, the operational situation and pressure from the front forced the commanders to continue the offensive, despite the demoralizing effect of their own losses. The command assessed the overall result as successful and symbolic, a breakthrough of the German defenses, laying the foundations for the subsequent liberation of Western Europe. Due to the limited disclosure of the scale of the tragedy, most families of the victims received official reports that their loved ones fell in combat with the enemy without knowing the true reasons. The bomber pilots who participated in the raids remained silent. For many, the topic remained painful and taboo for life, and the truth about the terrible mistake only came to light decades later, after military archives were declassified and scientific studies on the operation were published. In the post-war years, the details of the tragedy surrounding the airstrikes against friendly positions during Operation Cobra remained virtually unknown, not only to the general public, but also to many participants in the fighting. The practice of concealing such friendly strikes was part of the official policy of the U.S. and Allied military command, aimed at maintaining the morale of the population and their own troops. Official reports described American losses as the result of fierce combat and complex combat circumstances, without analyzing errors in airfire control or the coordination of aircraft and infantry. Such silence was characteristic of many episodes of World War II. Concealing the scale of friendly fire was part of the code of war. For many families of soldiers killed during Operation Cobra, the true cause of death remained unclear and inaccessible. Death notices typically contained general phrases, "killed in action," "killed in the line of duty," without providing detailed information. Thus, the victims' families remained in the dark, sometimes unaware of the connection to the airstrike tragedy. The bomber pilots who participated in the mission to destroy German positions suffered severe psychological trauma. Many of them avoided talking about Operation Cobra and the rare loss of Allied troops in their own ranks. Veterans' monologues and memoirs reveal a persistent desire to forget these episodes or to view them as tragic but inevitable consequences of war. However, the development of historical scholarship and the partial declassification of military archives in the last decades of the 20th and early 21st centuries have shed light on the Cobra tragedy. Publications, studies, and documentaries have made history more accessible and open, allowing for a fairer understanding of the events. One of the most shameful and tragic episodes in the history of the Allied coalition, when the complexity of technical and tactical nuances led to an unintentional friendly fire, has been recognized. Military academies have conducted a series of studies aimed at studying the errors of infantry-aircraft interaction, developing new methods of command and control of fire support, and reducing the risk of friendly fire in combat situations. These lessons have made a significant contribution to the development of modern military theories and practices of force interaction. Despite heavy losses from friendly fire and the tragedies of the first days, Operation Cobra itself became a strategic success for the Allies on the Western Front of World War II. As early as July 25th, American troops began a rapid advance south and east of St. Lo, emerging from the protracted trench warfare that had dragged on since the Normandy landings. Together with the infantry divisions of the 7th and 8th Corps under artillery cover, the tanks managed to break through the dense bocage, hedgerows that had effectively slowed the advance for a long time due to their density and ability to conceal defenses. Thanks to the carpet bombing and the German defenders' misfires, a gap opened in the front, through which the American armored vehicles were able to advance rapidly. In the following days, General Patton's Third Army began advancing south, consolidating its gains and capturing the towns of Avranches and St. Lo. Their actions allowed them to approach the German border, leaving the German army in Normandy in a critical situation. Particularly significant was the formation of the Falaise Pocket, a powerful encirclement of Wehrmacht troops east of Saumur, where tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped, most of whom became Allied prisoners. The German command launched a series of counterattacks, including Operation Lüttich, but the coordinated Allied offensive and the doomed German forces turned attempts to restore the front line into a futile struggle. Despite fierce fighting, the German army was unable to hold out, suffering massive losses in men and equipment. The crushing defeat of German forces in Normandy became a turning point, leading to the subsequent liberation of France and the Allied advance to the German border. Estimates of the Normandy campaign indicate enormous losses on both sides, over 450,000 killed, wounded, and missing on the German side, and approximately 210,000 American soldiers and officers, of whom over 37,000 died. Despite these casualties, the Allies managed to increase the pressure, which proved decisive for the overall outcome of the war in Western Europe. Achieving the goals of Operation Cobra did not erase the pain and losses associated with the tragedies of errors during the massive use of aircraft in close proximity to friendly forces. These events underscored the need to improve coordination, communication, and methods of tank-aircraft cooperation, which remain key aspects of military affairs to this day. Official tactical and operational success will forever remain in textbooks, and silence about tragic mistakes will serve as a reminder of the price of war, paid not only by the victors, but also by their own soldiers. Operation Cobra was one of the decisive moments of the summer of 1944, allowing the Allies to break through the German front in Normandy and liberate a significant portion of France. However, this breakthrough came at a high price. In addition to the usual losses on the battlefield, massive airstrikes on their own positions resulted in the deaths of over 1,000 American soldiers, casting a tragic shadow over the successful campaign. During the fighting in Normandy, the Allies lost over 210,000 men, of whom approximately 37,000 were killed. The Germans suffered even greater losses, over 450,000, including 240,000 killed and wounded. These figures reflect the intensity and ferocity of the fighting, particularly in the infamous Falaise Pocket, where the European conflict reached its peak. Unfortunately, tragic incidents of friendly fire, particularly in the early days of Operation Cobra, became emblematic not only of human error, but also of the organizational and communication problems inherent in total military cooperation on the scale of World War II. Many soldiers and officers, under attack from their own air support, experienced profound shock and demoralization, which impacted their unit's combat effectiveness. Lieutenant General George Patton, who led the Third Army and suffered significant losses in his group, wrote in his diary about these tragedies, calling them criminal, but inevitable in the chaos of war. His fury and demand for accountability underscored the scale of the problem. But at the same time, the command understood that halting the offensive was impossible. Meanwhile, success on the battlefield allowed the Allies to expand their control over Normandy, advance into the French hinterland, and pave the way for a further advance deeper into occupied Europe. However, the breakthrough was marred by tragedies that remained in the shadows of official history for years. A silence forced by censorship and political necessity obscured the true scale of Allied losses. After the war, Operation Cobra was the subject of numerous studies and post-war analyses, examining in detail the causes of friendly air losses and developing measures to ensure the safety and precision of interaction between various branches of the armed forces in modern warfare. These lessons, though costly, later became the foundation for the development of battlefield command and the saving of lives in future conflicts. Thus, Operation Cobra was not only a victory of strategy and tactics, but also a tragedy of human error, revealing the full cost of war in lost lives. The strength of the breakthrough and the scale of the success were diminished by the weight of the moral burden, which remained unresolved for a long time. Until the late 20th century, the true story of Operation Cobra and the tragedies associated with it remained largely a taboo. Official documents, many of which were classified or restricted in access, described these losses as combat losses, without emphasizing incidents of friendly fire. Families of fallen American soldiers and officers often received letters stating something like "killed in action," without a detailed explanation of the cause of the tragedy. Pilots and military personnel who participated in air operations typically avoided discussing friendly fire. This was often driven not by fear of punishment, but by deep psychological trauma and guilt. Centuries later, as studies of similar cases show, the unresolved psychological consequences of such experiences continue to impact the lives of veterans and those around them. In the 1990s and 2000s, with the declassification of archives and the advancement of historical scholarship, More candid studies of Operation Cobra began to emerge. Publications, documentaries, and conferences emerged, analyzing the failures in troop and Air Force coordination. This data revealed the difficulty of conducting large-scale joint operations, given the technology and conditions of 1944. In Western countries, these events are viewed not only as military experience, but also as lessons in ethics and responsibility in war. Military academies incorporate the study of Cobra errors into tactical interaction and battlefield command programs, emphasizing the importance of control and precision in saving lives during operations involving air and ground forces. In recent decades, public interest in the dark pages of military conflicts, including the tragedies of friendly fire, has grown. Initiatives have emerged to create memorials, educational programs, and museum exhibits that convey truthful information about the cost of war, helping to preserve the memory of those who died, not only by the enemy, but also by accident or mistake. In Russia, Eastern Europe, and the United States, there is a practice of openly acknowledging past mistakes, which fosters an understanding of the diversity of factors that influence battle outcomes and casualties among one's own forces. Operation Cobra exemplifies this. Success achieved at the cost of thousands of lives cannot be forgotten or hushed up to prevent a repeat. Moreover, with the growing availability of the internet and digital archives, the truth about such tragedies can now be revealed to a wider audience, who can appreciate not only military strategy, but also the human stories, tragedies, and victims that arose in the chaos of war. This process is important for preserving historical memory and building a more responsible society. Operation Cobra has gone down in the history of World War II as one of the key moments that changed the course of the fighting on the Western Front. With its help, the Allies broke through the Germans in Normandy, liberated Western France, hastened the fall of Nazi Germany, and hastened the end of the war. However, this success came at a grave cost. Numerous casualties from their own attacks, the second largest such tragedy after the Battle of Anzio. Cobra was, arguably, an operation where human error, technological limitations, and combat conditions exacted a dramatic price. Millions of bombs, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of tanks contributed to victory. But losses from friendly fire served as a reminder that even the best laid plans can be undermined by accidents, communication errors, and flawed approaches. In military history, Cobra has become a testament to the need for continuous improvement in coordination and communication between branches of the armed forces, precision strike guidance, and tighter control over airstrikes in close proximity to friendly forces. The lessons learned from Cobra laid the foundation for the development of modern systems of cooperation between aviation, artillery, and ground forces, including the use of GPS, digital maps, and open communication channels to minimize the risk of error. No victory is complete without losses. Not only military strategists and engineers, but also scientists, psychologists, and trainers work to address this, ensuring the training of soldiers and developing technologies to mitigate the negative consequences of war. The memory of those thousands of soldiers who died not in combat with the enemy, but as a result of friendly error, remains an important part of military legacy. Today, Operation Cobra is studied not only as a success story, but also as a warning. Military might demands responsibility, and victory does not justify forgetting the sacrifices. From time to time, its tragedies surface, reminding us of the cost of war and the need for humanity even in the harshest conditions. That's why the story of Cobra is not only a lesson for the military, but also for anyone who seeks to understand the complex relationship between war, technology, and human life.